Check, check. Check, check.
Test it out. Oh,
Check, check. Check, check.
Hey, Doug. You do this? All right. How are we doing? Good. So we're still, hey, Mike and I just been out today, so I've been out on the floor doing everything. Just remembering some of the key, eliminating the Yes, so we asked about Hansen as well. No, so you know that market watch report about our deadlines for apparently on some content stuff. But we haven't gotten a response. No, some of the Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to our subcommittee hearing for work and welfare. The title of today's subcommittee hearing, Measuring Poverty, How the Biden Administration Plans to Redraw the Poverty Line, and Rob Resources from Rural America. I want to welcome our witnesses here today and thank you for joining us for today's hearing on measuring poverty. My name is Darren LaHood. I represent the 16th District of Illinois, which covers much of central and northwest parts of the state. The purpose of today's hearing is to highlight the potential executive overreach and major policy and budgetary implications of changing the nation's poverty measure, which drives decision-making about how federal funds are distributed to families in need. In May, as many of you know, the National Academy of Sciences report recommended the Biden administration replace the official poverty measure with what is called, quote, supplemental poverty measure, unquote, as the nation's headline poverty statistic and adopted as the nation's principal poverty measure. This report is concerning, as changing the measure would have profound implications for how federal assistance is distributed to millions of Americans across the country. For years, National Academy of Sciences reports have been quietly used as the basis for updates on how the federal government measures poverty. For example, two reports in 1995 and 2005 called for the creation of the supplemental poverty measure, which was later published for the first time in 2010 under the Obama administration. Numerous federal benefit programs tie eligibility to the official poverty measure, and federal dollars are often distributed to states based on the number of families in poverty to target dollars where is the highest need. Some of the programs tied to the current official poverty measure include Medicaid, SNAP, Head Start, Social Services Block Grant, and the National School Lunch Program. In addition, the Biden administration recently proposed tying TANF funds to the official poverty measure. Because of the structure of the supplemental poverty measure, elevating it would dramatically alter the poverty line, ultimately increasing spending on means-tested programs. Only looking at two programs, Medicaid and SNAP, the American Enterprise Institute estimated government spending could rise by more than $124 billion over the next decade if the supplemental poverty measure was adopted. It would also result in the redistribution of funds from low cost of living in rural states, to high cost of living in states. For example, California would see their poverty rate increase by nearly 6%, while Mississippi would see their poverty rate drop by nearly 4%. Alarmingly, President Biden, through the Office of Management and Budget, has sole authority to act on the National Academy of Science recommendation and change the official measure without congressional approval. This would not be unprecedented. Earlier this year, the Biden administration acted unilaterally to update USDA Thrifty Food Plan, abandoning a 45-year cost neutrality policy, and hiked food stamp benefits by 27%. The CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office, estimated that the change will cost $250 billion over the next decade alone. It is Congress's responsibility to set the poverty line and ensure government benefits are delivered fairly and equitably to those who need them most, not the administration or unelected bureaucrats. In particular, our rural communities depend on the resources and programs Congress provides to deliver necessary services and fight poverty on the ground. Redirecting resources away from rural communities would have a devastating effect. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on the history of how the United States set the official poverty measure, problems associated with the supplemental poverty measure, and how the Biden administration could fundamentally change program eligibility and the allocation of federal resources with the stroke of a pen. This issue deserves our immediate attention to ensure Congress is responsible for defining poverty and delivering resources to our citizens who need it most. Again, I want to thank our witnesses today and our guests for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, the ranking member, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing. and I want to thank all of the witnesses for coming. Mr. Chairman, I believe that child poverty is a moral emergency. It is inexcusable that children in the wealthiest nation in the world are growing up in poverty. Poverty exacts tremendous suffering from our youngest citizens, causing massive gaps in cognitive learning, increasing risk of hunger and homelessness, and raising the likelihood of lower lifetime earnings and poverty as an adult. In the face of that emergency, I am deeply concerned about how unproductive this Republican House remains frozen by an extremist agenda and failing at the most basic acts of governing while children and families wait. Due to strong federal investment by Democrats and President Biden, especially the expanded child tax credit, child poverty precipitously dropped by almost half between 2020 and 2021, the lowest rate on record. In the chairs in my home state of Illinois, child poverty dropped by 51% in 2021. This record drop in child poverty reached the Black, brown, and rural children who are disproportionately likely to be poor. Approximately 122,000 children in my district received monthly payments from the child tax credit, and that helped to buy food, pay rent, keep the heat on, keep the lights on, and provide the stability needed to grow up healthy and strong. The John Burden Advocates for Youth found that the foster youth in their tax clinics received an average child tax credit of $3,161 to help their young families. Alarmingly, just 1 year after the Republican-led expiration of these poverty-lowering investments in workers and families, the child poverty rate more than doubled, causing the biggest one-year increase in poverty we've ever seen. It pains me that over 1/4 of the children in my congressional district are poor. The progress we made in 2021 shows that we can slash child poverty when we have the political will to do so. While I have a great deal of respect and reverence for academicians, I don't think that we really need academics quibbling about the nuances of how we measure poverty. The doubling of child poverty in our country in 1 year is a 5-alarm fire. Academics arguing about how to measure that fire leaves children suffering and weakens our nation. The focus on the minutiae of poverty measurement ignores the wide array of other indicators of the hardships that families experience: food insecurity, hunger, housing instability, homelessness, debt, or having the heat turned off. This subcommittee should be taking action to eliminate child poverty, not attacking struggling parents. We should restore the child tax credit, dramatically increase child care funding to address the child care cliff that will force some parents to leave their jobs, and enact comprehensive paid family and medical leave and other policies that research and experience prove effective. After this conversation today, I hope we can work together to end child poverty. I realize that the House Republicans must resolve the dysfunction within their caucus before we can act. This inability to govern has prevented us from doing our work for 3 weeks, despite an urgent need to keep our government operating, address the child care cliff, and stand by our allies. It is shameful, quite frankly, that this Congress is not taking strong, immediate action to end poverty using policies proven to work. Every day we delay action, poverty poisons the future for millions of our children and for our nation. So, Mr. Chairman, Democrats stand ready. I stand ready to set an aggressive child poverty reduction target and hold ourselves accountable to restore income supports, to strengthen families, and cut child poverty. Again, I thank you for calling this hearing, and I thank all of our witnesses for coming, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. We'll now go to introductions of our witnesses. We have 5 really terrific witnesses today. Again, thank you for being here today. I'll introduce them from left to right. We have Dr. Kevin Corinth, who is the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at the American Enterprise Institute. We next have Professor Doug Besharov, who is a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. We will then turn to Dr. Meyer, Dr. Bruce Meyer, who is the McCormick Foundation Professor of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. We next have Mr. David Hansen. He is the Director of Educational Opportunities and Investments for Perry County, Ohio, Job and Family Services. And lastly, Elaine Maag, who is the Senior Fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. We will now begin with you, Dr. Corinth, for your testimony. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify about poverty measurement this afternoon. How we measure poverty matters. It informs societal progress in improving the lives of poor Americans and helps target government assistance to families in need. These objectives are threatened by the elevation of the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM. Making the SPM the official poverty measure would make it harder to assess whether poor families are made better off each year and make government programs less effective at targeting the neediest Americans. From the perspective of accurately measuring poverty, the SPM does one thing correct. It corrects the failure of the official poverty measure to count the bulk of assistance provided to the poor, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps, and housing assistance. However, the SPM goes wrong in how it sets poverty thresholds, that is, the dollar amount below which families are considered poor. The SPM breaks with decades of precedent under the official poverty measure, which simply asked whether the poor are becoming better off over time. The SPM takes a radically different approach by transforming poverty into a measure of inequality, asking whether the poor outperform the middle class. Under the SPM, helping middle-class families better afford housing or purchase more groceries can perversely lead to an increase in poverty, even if poor people themselves are made better off at the same time. Another problem with the SPM is how needlessly complicated the thresholds are. In fact, there are over 46,000 different thresholds under the SPM for a single year. In reality, the poverty line is a simple value judgment about how much is enough to no longer be in poverty. The complexity of the SPM thresholds obscures this basic fact, allowing experts to determine how much is enough under the false guise of scientific expertise. A final problem with the SPM is that it sets lower poverty thresholds in places where families spend less on housing. This makes poverty appear less prevalent in places like West Virginia and Mississippi, in spite of research that finds poor people in these and other low-income states are worse off than poor people in high-income states like California and New York. These problems should raise concerns about recent actions by the Census Bureau to elevate the SPM, which is now published alongside the official poverty measure and no longer clearly delineated as a research measure. A recent National Academy of Sciences report goes even further, recommending that the SPM be elevated to the nation's headline poverty statistic. This alarming recommendation provides scientific cover for the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, to unilaterally declare the SPM the official poverty measure with no input from Congress whatsoever. Making the SPM the official poverty measure would have profound effects on government programs. Over the years, Congress has pegged eligibility for programs like food stamps, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act premium tax credits to the official poverty line. For example, families must have incomes of no higher than 130% of the official poverty line to qualify for food stamps, and no higher than 400% of the official poverty line to qualify for ACA premium tax credits. Making the SPM the official poverty measure would automatically increase eligibility for these programs, and as a result, tack on an additional $124 billion of government spending over the next decade. Making the SPM the official measure would also reallocate federal aid from low-income states to high-income states because of the geographic adjustment of SPM thresholds. Families in states like West Virginia and Mississippi could be disqualified from means-tested benefits despite having similar incomes to families who maintain eligibility in states like California and New York. In addition, federal aid tied to poverty rates in an area, such as Title I education grants, the Community Development Block Grant, and the New Markets Tax Credit, would be reallocated from low-income states to high-income states. Decisions about who should qualify for government programs and how aid should be allocated across states do not belong with the Census Bureau. Injecting political decision-making into our independent statistical agencies would threaten their well-deserved reputation for producing accurate, transparent, and apolitical statistics. Congress should protect its authority over government programs, defend our statistical agencies from involvement in political decisions, and promote accurate and transparent poverty statistics. It can do so by preempting OMB from manipulating the official poverty measure. Congress could then take on the task of improving the measure itself, focusing on accounting for taxes and in-kind transfers while maintaining simple and transparent thresholds. This would protect congressional authority over major government programs and improve our ability to measure success in improving the lives of poor Americans. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now recognize Professor Besharov for 5 minutes. You are now recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman LaHood and Ranking Member Davis, and also the members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here. I teach at the University of Maryland. I teach poverty alleviation, and I teach program evaluation, so I feel home. And in 2004 to 2007, I chaired a commission that had people from the left and the right thinking about working on poverty measures. So I come at this with a little bit of experience, but some chagrin. Let me explain. Everybody thinks we should be counting the almost $300 billion in benefits that low-income Americans get. There's agreement about that. And with all due respect to my conservative friends, after they say, let's count it, we don't really have a good answer for what that will do to our thinking about poverty. Because if you use the official poverty measure and you dump $300 billion of aid into it, poverty all but disappears under the official poverty measure. So that can't be the way we want to go. And my liberal friends say, okay, let's put in these $300 billion of benefits, but then let's raise the thresholds. And what they did was they raised the thresholds higher than the official poverty line, in effect, raising the amount of poverty in the country and increasing, if this is implemented in eligibility requirements, increasing the amount of spending that goes to people labeled poor. Now, I'm particularly looking at the Democratic members of this subcommittee because I don't think this is a partisan issue when it comes to the definition. There are winners and losers in this definition. And Mr. Davis, with all due respect, you didn't use pointy-headed, but I will say I'm a pointy-headed academic. Let me tell you what these measures, as you all know, determine the flow of funds, including Title I to your districts. So I will just tell you what they do to your constituents, okay? Elder poverty goes up. Child poverty goes down. Hispanic poverty goes up. Asian poverty goes up. Black poverty does not change. Now, when you go to thinking about this, when it's time to write this legislation, I am sure you will worry about that mixture. And I think take this hearing and the conversation here, not as, well, there's just one way to do it, but just realize that this is the flow of money to your constituents. And so you can say, we're minutiae today, but when it comes to what happens here, though there are some groups in your districts that will gain and lose. And so I think it behooves you to look at those provisions and say, isn't there a way to do this better? Why is elder poverty going up and child poverty going down? You all, Mr. Davis, in your introduction, you talked about child poverty. I agree with you, but this measure does just the opposite. Just the opposite. Okay, what's to do about this? And I apologize for being sort of informal about this. This measure is unbelievably complicated and is minutiae in ways that I can't even remember. I need a crib sheet to know what it does. But here's what I also know. The Congress, when it sets eligibility for these programs, when it says 135% of poverty, or 185% of poverty, or for Medicaid up to 400%, it has in mind the number underneath that percent. It's not thinking about just $28,000 or $55,000. I mean, not just twice the poverty line. It's thinking about those dollar amounts. So I've thought about this a lot. The solution is going to be messy, and I believe you all should consider locking in the benefit levels in your districts before they change this so that your districts gain or lose money. And I think that's the natural bipartisan approach here that will, in the short run, be an answer. In the long run, we have to deal with how we more accurately measure poverty. Anyway, I have 19 seconds more, and I don't need them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Now recognize Dr. Meyer for you deliver your opening remarks. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Bruce Meyer, McCormick Foundation Professor at the University of Chicago. For 40 years, I have focused on the accuracy of government data.
Sir, is your microphone on?
Thank you. I have worked for and advised the main federal agencies measuring poverty. A recent National Academy of Sciences report recommended making the supplemental poverty measure the principal poverty measure. Such a change would be counterproductive. In my testimony, I have 6 conclusions. First, statistical agencies should focus on better measuring income and spending rather than changing poverty thresholds that are value judgments and ultimately arbitrary. Those who devised the original poverty thresholds understood that where you draw the line is subjective or arbitrary. The thresholds set in the 1960s were picked to achieve a desired poverty rate, with the food budget decided on to achieve that end, rather than the other way around. This principle was overlooked in the recent NAS report that focuses on devising ever more complicated but ultimately arbitrary thresholds. Second, to better measure family income, we should enhance survey data with administrative data. When Census Bureau survey data on income such as earnings, pensions, or government payments are compared to individual tax or government payment records, they almost invariably indicate underreporting. Often close to half a given income type is missed in the Census Bureau's current population survey, the source of official poverty statistics. This problem has worsened over time. The Census Bureau realizes this problem and has supported 2 large-scale projects, one of which I lead, to combine administrative data with survey data. The administrative data come from the IRS and programs that pay out benefits. These data are currently only used experimentally. Additional data sharing agreements across agencies and federal legislation are needed. When administrative data are substituted for erroneous survey data where possible, poverty is almost halved. We can see that government programs reach more people. It just wasn't recorded in the surveys. The SPM makes the problem of income underreporting worse, likely because the income transfers and taxes it includes are particularly misreported. In response to the problem of underreported survey income, the Social Security Administration recently stopped 2 publications. Like the SSA, the Census Bureau should consider discontinuing the publication of poverty statistics until it has the combined survey and administrative data in place to measure income accurately. Third, consumption poverty measures are often more informative. Given that administrative sources of income are incomplete and they are not available historically, a good alternative is consumption data. Consumption poverty is a more direct measure of living standards and identifies a more deprived group of poor individuals, which is the goal of poverty measurement. The BLS began publishing consumption poverty this year. This effort should be further supported. Fourth, the much publicized poverty reduction claims for the expanded CTC are greatly exaggerated. Many have claimed that poverty of children doubled in 2022 because the 2021 temporary changes to the CTC expired. This example shows how statistics may be skewed by income data quality issues. Consumption poverty declined through this period as low-income families were able to afford to spend more on food, housing, and other goods in 2022 than 2021. One of the reasons for this is that they saved much of their stimulus payments. Even the Census Bureau income numbers say the CTC expansion played a much smaller role than the stimulus payments in this period, which makes sense since the stimulus payments were much larger. Even the 35% increase in 2022 child poverty the census attributed to the CTC changes, not doubling, is too high because it counted in the 2021 poverty numbers expanded CTC payments received as refunds in 2022, another reason to prefer the consumption numbers to get the timing right. Fifth, proposed poverty measurement changes should be based on evidence. The SPM does a worse job of identifying the most deprived families than either the OPM or consumption poverty measures. This happens in part because the SPM raises poverty in high income areas and lowers it in low income areas. Problematically, people in low income areas are markedly worse off, according to a wide range of indicators, including mortality, health, assets, long-run income, housing characteristics, ability to pay bills, education, and food security. Sixth and last, Congress should rethink its reliance on a broken NAS. Congress asks the NAS to provide advice on many topics. Unfortunately, the NAS mixes political judgments with its scientific tasks. The overwhelming political slant of report authors has been documented. As a result, large errors such as those in a recent CTC and child poverty report have gone unacknowledged and uncorrected. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Now recognize Director Hansen for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experience working in rural America with some of our most vulnerable citizens, and on how adjusting the current poverty line would impact our community and the services we provide. My name is David Hansen. I'm the Director of Educational Opportunities for Perry County Job and Family Services in Southeast Ohio. I lead Perry County's workforce development activities. I focus my work on guiding individuals out of government dependence through work and toward economic independence and security. There are 36,000 residents in our rural Appalachian community. The cultural and economic heritage of Perry County is deeply rooted in coal. But the last coal mine closed in 2019. Having literally powered the industrial might of Ohio and the U.S. for decades, Perry County now ranks 76th out of 88 Ohio counties in terms of poverty. I urge you to consider a few examples I see that I can share out of many on how the specific proposal would work against rural communities as I understand it. To help our families, we rely on funding from TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, and on Medicaid, and on supports for childcare. Replacing the official poverty measure with the supplemental poverty measure would lower eligibility for these programs in Perry County. It would do the same to many other programs, including SNAP, the Supplemental Assistance for Needy Families program, and the National School Lunch Program. All of these are vital to food security, health, and childcare, and these in turn are essential in helping someone out of poverty through work and training. The proposal would impact large parts of our work funded by WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. WIOA is so important to us in increasing investment in skills and learning on the part of individuals, and so help them to hold good-paying, family-supporting jobs. under the supplemental poverty measure, Ohio's poverty rate would go down by 2.3 percentage points just by changing the definition. This means for Ohio less funding from federal programs that distribute dollars based on proportional poverty rates across all the states. But within Ohio itself, the impact on rural Perry County would be even greater. I estimate the proposal would lead to a decrease in the official county poverty rate of about 5 to 6 percentage points, or 25% of the current count. Yet none of the newly unpoor would actually be any better prepared for work-based independence or have better access to transportation or childcare or food security, all required for training and work. Here are some reasons why I believe it would work this way. Our community does not have access to the same funding streams as do urban areas and cannot afford many activities often related to resolving poverty that urban areas can. Their absence in rural areas adds significant costs in ways that may not be captured by the supplemental poverty measure. Some of our local governments have only 2% of the property tax funding base per resident than a typical urban county. As a result, we don't have community centers in Perry County for youth drug prevention activities, nor do we have year-round recreational facilities for adults for their health and engagement in supportive programs such as weight loss. Here's another very specific example. Our agency holds an annual back-to-school bash for TANF-eligible families in the summer. We share with them the basic needs for a new school year: backpacks, tennis shoes, school supplies, and their school spirit sweatshirts. In urban areas, better funded schools, and the property tax remains a large component of K-12 finance in Ohio, these better funded schools often get this organized and financed on their own. But in Perry County, it falls on our agency, and we use TANF for this event. I don't see how the 200 families who would be dropped from our back-to-school bash under the proposed new poverty measure would be better off for it. The SPM would not capture the added back-to-school costs that would be borne by residents in Perry County when it wouldn't typically fall on disadvantaged families in better-funded suburban and urban districts. We and other rural communities can't afford the workforce-oriented public transit systems that urban areas have. Nearly 80% of our W-2 workforce leaves for jobs in urban counties entirely without public transit options at a cost not accounted for. Nor can we afford many small programs with really big impact on those in poverty. Rural Ohio typically lacks zoning and land banks. These two programs can really improve the lower end of a community's housing market. The urban to rural disparity of funding and policy means that quality and livability per dollar evaluation of affordable housing in urban areas is, in my view, far better than what I've seen in rural Ohio. Many private activities of Perry County have withered with the loss of the coal industry and manufacturing. Social clubs, fraternal orders, union halls, and even churches, with all that they can do to help people in need, are in steep decline in the community. That's another uncaptured cost. Economically, we do not have a Walmart in the county, and the people we serve are not online to begin with, let alone on Amazon looking for inexpensive shopping. The high cost of diminished commercial activity can be seen in the absence of a private driver's ed school in Perry County. Driver's ed in Ohio is typically a small business activity, widespread in urban and suburban and small town Ohio. Instead, in Perry County, you have to leave the county to get a license. The added cost of fuel, vehicle access, time, and more to get a license is beyond so many of the people we serve, and it won't be captured by the supplemental poverty measure that I can see. As for my work, the lack of a driver's license is a major barrier in getting many of our customers to work and training. If the administration were to adopt this supplemental poverty measure, Ohio and rural communities like Perry County would suffer. There are value judgments to be made about the quality of life in rural America and in fairness and equity between rural and urban communities. For these value judgments, Congress should have responsibility for making the decisions. Chairman LaHood, Chairman Smith, and members of the community, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Hansen. We'll now turn to our last witness, Ms. Maag, for your 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to share insights on recent policies that have reduced poverty. Investing in children, particularly those in families with low incomes, can produce a lifetime of benefits. I am a senior fellow in the Urban Institute Brookings Institution Tax Policy Center and a co-director of the Innovations in Cash Assistance for Children initiative. The views expressed in this testimony are my own and should not be attributed to the Urban Institute, its trustees, or its funders. For children to thrive, they need to have basic needs met. Yet 12.4% of children were living below the poverty line in 2022, a tremendous jump from the 5.2% of children living in poverty in 2021. The jump in child poverty was largely driven not by changes in economics or demographics. It was a policy choice. During 2021, the federal government adopted a robust set of economic supports that dramatically decreased poverty, including an expansion of the child tax credit. When the expansion expired, the resulting increase in child poverty was unprecedented. Never before had so much progress been made to reduce poverty, only to have it evaporate after a single year. Absent the expansion, about 19 million children in the lowest income families are unable to receive the full credit because their parents don't earn enough. Children left out of the full credit are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Children living in rural America are more likely to be left out than urban children. Besides substantially reducing child poverty, the expanded child tax credit also reduced hardship, and it fostered parental investments in their children. The most substantial federal investments in children are refundable tax credits, including the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. But the credits are not as effective as they could be. Research suggests that the earned income tax credit reduces income inequality between Black and white households in the 25th and 50th income percentiles, but does little at the 10th income percentile. The child tax credit delivers a benefit to about 90% of families with children. The benefits from the credit are not equal. On average, middle and high-income families with children receive more from the child tax credit than those with low incomes. This upside-down investment is costly. Researchers estimate that child poverty costs the U.S. between $500 billion and $1.03 trillion annually. Children experiencing poverty tend to earn less and pay less in taxes as adults, and they are more likely to require public supports later in life. Growing up in poverty is correlated with a host of negative outcomes: reduced cognitive development, starting school less prepared to succeed, and experience reduced academic achievement and skill development. They are less likely to graduate from high school or college and have lower paying and less stable jobs later in life. Long-term, on average, they face substantially reduced earnings and poor health outcomes, likely related to inadequate access to medical care. Policy choices can and did disrupt this cycle. When the child tax credit was expanded and reduced child poverty to never-before recorded lows. Early effects of the expanded child tax credit have been well documented by numerous researchers at many institutions, and the evidence continues to mount. As noted, the child tax credit played a substantial role in reducing child poverty. Researchers also documented a 25% decline in food insufficiency among low-income Black, Hispanic, and white children. During the time of the advanced child tax credit payments, families reported not only having enough to eat, but they were more likely to report eating healthier, balanced meals relative to those who did not receive the payments. The expanded child tax credit corresponded with reductions in financial hardships. Families who received the payments reported declines in credit card debt and a reduced reliance on high-cost financial services, payday loans, pawn shops, selling plasma. Among recipients of Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits, researchers found families were more likely to be able to pay utility bills. In New York City, child tax credit recipients were less likely to report they ran out of money before the end of the month. Parents invested in their children's futures, purchasing tutoring services and extracurricular activities. This was especially true among Black and Hispanic and other non-white households. In some cases, families reported using the money to save for college, a pathway to improved economic opportunity. The expanded child credit allowed families to better meet the needs of their children. The credit reduced food insecurity, fostered economic security, and allowed parents to invest in their children. Research shows that investing in children can lead to a lifetime of benefits for both the children and society. The expansion was ultimately a limited experiment in the power of policies to lift up even very low-income children.
Thank you for your testimony. Before we go to questions and answers, I do want to recognize our full committee chairman, Chairman Jason Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and thank all the witnesses for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule. Today's hearing is on the surface about an issue that otherwise might draw very little attention with average day Americans, but a discussion over how the government chooses to define one of various metrics it uses to allocate resources is not likely to reach the front pages of America's newspapers. And yet, as this hearing will show today, this issue will have a profound impact on millions of Americans and the communities, particularly rural communities where they live and work. As my colleagues are aware, numerous social services and child welfare programs base their eligibility requirements on what's known as the official poverty measure that the Census Bureau produces annually. Federal resources are then targeted towards states and communities with higher instances of poverty. But now the Biden administration is considering unilaterally discarding that standard and using a new metric that will result in an estimated $124 billion in new welfare spending over the next decade. But even more concerning is that this change will divert resources away from America's rural communities. Under the supplemental poverty measure that the administration is considering using to redraw the poverty line, in a high cost of living state like California, the poverty line for a family of 4 would be as high as $47,000 and as low as $32,300 in the state of Alabama. That means families in rural states and communities have to be poorer than families in places like California in order to access SNAP and Medicaid benefits. This is about robbing resources from rural America and rewarding coastal elites, all under the cloak of a recommendation from a National Academy panel that is overwhelmingly liberal. Instead of focusing limiting funds on politically charged research, we should focus our attention on support that helps families in poverty gain the employment skills they need to lift themselves out of poverty. I also cannot help but mention that the metric the administration recommended is a useful tool for our Democrat colleagues because it inflates the actual benefits of massive federal spending through programs like the so-called America Rescue Plan Act. It gives them the ability to decry the loss of that sugar-high spending as soon as the money runs out. It's a not-so-clever attempt to demand more federal spending at all times, at all cost. Also troubling is the way in which this change is measuring poverty can come about. Under current law, the White House's Office of Management and Budget has sole authority to change the metric that is used. In other words, an executive agency can make a dramatic change in how federal tax dollars are spent, impacting millions of our fellow citizens without an ounce of input from Congress. It seems appropriate that this committee should consider whether leaving that power in the hands of unelected bureaucrats is as foolish as it sounds. After all, the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, not the executive branch. That question is made all the more important considering that we are talking about programs that have a direct impact on millions of individuals and families struggling to just get by. Thank you, Chairman LaHood, for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. We will now proceed to question and answer portion of the hearing, and I'll recognize myself. As has been talked about, many federal programs have proportional allocation formulas that are based on a number of individuals living below the official poverty line and distribute funding based on each state's share of families in poverty relative to the other states. This is in order to target federal dollars to states and communities with the highest need. The higher the poverty rate a state has, the more federal dollars a state receives through programs like the Child Care Block Grant, Special Education Grants, and Community Development Block Grants. Likewise, the lower the poverty rate, the less federal dollars a state receives through these programs. This chart behind me and on the 2 television monitors here show the poverty rate change if the Biden administration were to adopt the National Academy of Science recommendation to replace the official poverty measure with the supplemental measure. As you can see, low cost of living states like Mississippi would see their poverty rate drop by nearly 4%, while high cost of living states like California would see their poverty rate increase by nearly 6%. The result of this change would mean Mississippi, which currently has the highest child poverty rate in the country, would receive fewer federal dollars, and California would receive more based on the new supplemental poverty rates. Dr. Corinth, you did the research behind this chart. What is it about the structure of the supplemental poverty measure that increases the poverty rate so much in California while decreasing so much in a state like West Virginia?
Thank you for the question. So the supplemental poverty measure adjusts thresholds based on how much people spend on housing. So if people spend more on housing in places like California and New York, as they do, that means that the poverty threshold will be higher in those areas. By contrast, if people spend less on housing in places like Mississippi and West Virginia, we'll then have a lower poverty threshold in those areas. As a result of those differing thresholds, the poverty rate will be much higher in places where the cost of housing is higher in places like California.
And can you comment the impact this is going to have on rural communities in particular?
Yeah, so rural communities, in those places, families spend a lot less on housing. Therefore, the thresholds will be lower and their poverty rates will be lower. As a result, these block grants that are targeted to places with higher poverty rates, those will be less likely to be directed to those rural areas.
And can you comment just procedurally, is it true the Biden administration could make the changes reflected on this map through executive action alone with no input from Congress or statutory changes?
That's correct. There's something called Statistical Policy Directive 14. This is a statistical policy directive that's put out by OMB. Under their sole authority, the OMB director could change that with no congressional input whatsoever.
Thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Meyer. Dr. Meyer, in 2021, Democrats dismantled the child tax credit, making work less valuable than a government check, unfortunately. Media outlets have made bold claims about the reduction in child poverty associated with expansion during COVID. Republicans doubled the child tax credit in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but I have serious concerns about delinking the credit from work, especially when we have a worker shortage right now. I understand that you have published some research that showed extending the Democrats' child tax credit would cause 1.5 million workers to exit the workforce. Can you talk about that, Dr. Meyer?
Thank you, Representative LaHood. I'm happy to talk about it. We had a consensus in the past that tax credits should redistribute income and encourage work at the same time. That was the idea behind the Earned Income Tax Credit and the original Child Tax Credit. For 1 year, we had a tax credit that discouraged work by taking away the work incentive that was built in to the current and prior child tax credit. Eliminating that work incentive, we estimated, based on the relationship between tax rates and employment that we'd seen in the past, that more than 1 million parents would leave the workforce if this child tax credit that is available regardless of whether you work were made permanent. We learned back in the case of welfare reform that giving money unconditionally to families can reduce work. When we changed welfare to be pro-work in the 90s, there was bipartisan consensus to do that. We saw that more than 1 million single mothers entered the workforce, and the living conditions of single-parent families improved substantially over time. We saw that even at the very bottom of the distribution, living conditions, spending on food, clothing, housing, and other goods increased quite appreciably, especially for those at the very bottom, after we reformed welfare to be pro-work rather than in the direction that the expanded child tax credit, which eliminated the requirement that people have earnings.
And Dr. Meyer, as an academic and a researcher who I know has spent a lot of time looking at various ways to measure poverty in your work, do you think the National Academy of Sciences process is working correctly, and what can be done to make the committee more balanced?
Well, there's a basic problem that the people that are generally appointed to these committees are quite skewed politically. My colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Scott Winship, has documented that rarely, almost never will you see someone who's centrist or conservative on one of these panels. And that has a real problem because there isn't the back and forth, there isn't the checking of what they do that would be desirable. I've pointed out that there was a major error in the report on child poverty issued a couple years ago, in that they counted the economic incentives and factored them in when it favored the policies that members of the committee wanted to argue, and then they ignored those same types of incentives when, for a different policy, it made it look worse. And I don't think that kind of thing would happen if you had a more centrist, balanced membership on these panels. These panels also take on tasks that are more political than scientific, and that just isn't what the National Academy of Sciences should work on.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for that. That concludes my questions. I'll now turn to Mr. Davis, the ranking member, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for all of your participation. Professor Besharov, I don't have much of a problem with research and measurement, but I do have some reservations sometimes about timing. So let me move on then and ask Ms. Maag. For years, structural racism have led to much higher rates of child poverty among children of color, especially Black children. And some of our past declines in poverty excluded children of color. What effect did the enhanced child tax credit that Democrats enacted in the American Rescue Plan Act have on poverty among Black children?
We saw dramatic declines in poverty among Black and Hispanic children when the child tax credit was made fully refundable.
In 2018, my Republican colleague Mike Gallagher and I started the Congressional Trauma-Informed Care Caucus to promote greater awareness of the challenges people face after exposure to trauma. We know that poverty is a cause of trauma for children. What kind of harm do they suffer when we fail to enact policies to fight poverty, including the lasting consequences when we don't act?
Poverty is harmful to children at all ages. It results in reduced gray matter development early in life, less prepared to attend school, less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to get a stable, well-paying job later on. There's excellent recent research that shows that it's not just that a single year in poverty is bad, but it becomes additive. So the more time a child spends in poverty, the worse the effects.
So the more effective approaches to dealing with trauma and how it impacts, would that be a beneficial activity for us to put more emphasis on to help reduce poverty?
Absolutely. Families need to be able to plan their budgets over the course of their children's lifetime so they can adequately save. It's important to keep programs in place and not pull the rug out from under families.
What other policies do you think might be helpful?
There's substantial work that can be done on childcare, where we could make sure that children have safe places to spend the time during the day. We can improve transportation. We could improve access to SNAP benefits in that National Academies report. They sort of looked at several avenues, and certainly increasing benefits, particularly in the summer or for families with teens, were two ways that you can cut against poverty.
So the more comprehensive our approaches are, the more likely we are to see positive results.
Absolutely. The programs end up being self-reinforcing. So if you put income into someone's life, they're more likely to get health care. If you give them health insurance, they're more likely to get health care. And so everything can work together to elevate the child and make sure we're not missing important aspects of development along the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Recognize Dr. Winstrup of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. I think it's very important. I appreciate our witnesses being here today. I want to welcome Mr. Hansen from my home state of Ohio. But I'm glad we're having this important hearing to discuss concerning the impact National Academy of Science report that recommended the Biden administration replace the nation's official poverty measure with supplemental poverty measure. How poverty is measured sets the eligibility for many important federal programs. But I'm finding it hard to understand why we should take federal dollars away from states with rural populations and lower cost of living to bail out states like California, who continue to implement policies that artificially raise the cost of things like housing and energy. So we're rewarding unaffordable, expensive housing rather than working to provide affordable housing, which I think is the answer to a lot of our ills. You know, let's face it, in America today, and when it comes to poverty issues, which I'm very passionate about, we have one party that has policies that are pro-dependence and decreased opportunities for people to come out of poverty, but to hold them there, and another that is pro-independence with increased opportunities. Mr. Hansen, your testimony, I appreciate you touch on the unique challenges that rural Appalachian communities in Ohio have, or they're facing when it comes to the impact of switching to SPL. I mentioned earlier that many programs rely on the poverty threshold to determine eligibility, one of them which is TANF. As you mentioned, in Ohio, TANF and WIOA can be braided together and targeted for career development. In other words, opportunities for independence for youth ages 14 through 24. Programs like this are vital to ensuring that federal and state programs are focused on lifting people out of poverty and into the workforce and into an independent lifestyle. You remind me of one of the caseworkers from my district, Julie Wise, who you may know in Highland County, who says that success for her would be for her job not to be needed anymore. That's how she defines success as she tries to help people and lift them out of poverty. Can you just touch on how this switch that they're talking about would impact that program specifically and some of the downstream effects that might occur?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So this program, the acronym in Ohio is the CCMEP, which braids together TANF and WIOA. It's geared to 14 to 24-year-olds at a particularly vulnerable period in trying to get people into the workforce and to give them the skill ladder that we use is just basic life skills. Can they respond to an alarm? Can they get to a job? Then comes what I call essential skills. Those are kind of the skills that keep you in your job. Do you know how to deal with a boss? Are you able to work in teams? Well, we have to start with 14-year-olds in trying to develop that skill level. Eventually, they do reach the highest level of learning the jobs that are, the skills that are required at a specific workplace. We are seeing in Central Ohio, on the borders of Representative Kerry's district and your district as well, pretty strong economic growth. But the demands, those are for mid-skilled and higher jobs. And it is really a challenge to help people understand that in a sense, this country, once upon a time, you stopped at 9th grade. Then we made a lot of progress by going to 12th grade. Now you got to go to 14th grade. Yet we have to really get that journey starting pretty early on. I would love to actually extend it somehow, and this would be a TANF avenue to start talking to 5th and 6th graders about their careers. In Ohio, the K through 12 system's been charged with that. They're stepping up their game, but there's still so much more that can be done to take advantage of the opportunity that's out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Corinth, can you touch on how switching to the supplemental poverty level would create perverse incentives for states with high cost of living to continue regulating and artificially increasing the cost of things such as housing and energy?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Wenstra, for the question. The biggest driver of the housing inaffordability crisis are excessive regulations on building housing. If you can't add more housing supply, then the price of housing goes up. This switch to the supplemental poverty measure would incentivize those regulations because now a state like California or say Los Angeles or San Francisco would be rewarded for excessive regulations that drive up housing costs because that's going to increase their poverty threshold and therefore lead to more federal aid going to their state.
Thank you, Dr. Winstrup. We'll now apply the 2-to-1 questioning rule. We'll turn to Mr. Carey of Ohio.
I want to thank you, Chairman LaHood, and the panel witnesses for coming in to discuss this urgent matter. It is good to see my dear friend David Hansen here from the Buckeye State. We've known each other for probably close to 20 years now, and I do have it on firm authority from his wife that I can treat you as a hostile witness. So, it is critical that we ensure that the administration does not redefine the federal poverty line, which would result in rural Americans losing valuable federal dollars. I want to just go to a couple questions because I want you to expand upon it. And I missed your testimony, I read your testimony, but Perry County was one of those counties in Ohio that was kind of went through many different phases. It started with pottery and then went into coal. And so now they're right on the verge of kind of where the new Intel plant is and just the county right next to it. So, Mr. Hansen, many are advocating for increasing monetary aid and removing work incentives for lower income individuals and families. In your opinion, what would be the effect in your community and your work of trying to help individuals re-enter the workforce if work requirements and incentives were removed from federal aid?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I just think it would just be setting us backwards. We have to help people to, what I say, expand their circles of experience, to understand that there's this really pretty fabulous 21st century economy out there. If you're in Perry County and your uncle worked in coal, you don't understand that it's got a different set of challenges now for you to thrive. I believe that people are really up to those challenges, but helping people to understand, and these are small rural communities that are fairly isolated. They don't understand what the opportunities are. They're not like us reading the newspapers and saying, oh my gosh, this is a fabulous landing that's happening in the state. The Intel plant, so the traditional coal mining world, solid workers, and I knew the 200 that were laid off from Buckingham, which is the last mine that was closed in Perry County. Any manufacturer would love to have them because they understood safety. Yet it was just such a different world because they really didn't have any certification. Nothing could be transferred because they worked within the mine. They knew how to use large, heavy equipment, but they'd still have to go back to a 6-month journey to get a heavy equipment license for anywhere else. Well, Intel is going to be offering 3,000 manufacturing jobs, and I talked to Perry County people about that. It's not coding in a basement. It's what you would like to do otherwise. And if you know Perry County, it's like a lot of rural America. It's open, it's outdoors, you live on 15 acres at least, you know how to fix a tractor and all that kind of stuff. This is something that they would like to have once they understand it. But you need the incentives, you need all kinds of things. The incentives complement what we do with outreach. When we try to hire social workers now, they have to be engaging. They have to be willing to look people in the eye. They have to be able to be friendly. They have to be willing to sit out in a parking lot of a Dollar General and say, hey, can I talk to you about what we can do for you? So you can see that we're trying all that we can. And, if the eligibility is decreased, that just means, the people that we're talking about who would kind of be the 200 that I mentioned in my testimony, they're not made any better off by that change at all.
To that, David, the other thing that people don't seem to understand is when you You said those 200 people that were laid off from the Buckingham mine, and I knew many of them personally myself. For every one coal mining job in a county, there are 4 spinoff jobs. So while you may have had 200 people that were affected, that number obviously goes up to 800 people that were affected in Perry County. Real quickly, because I'm going to run out of time, do you feel that this is the best strategy to uplift people from poverty and break the generational grip of economic insecurity by having these work incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely do.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Recognize Ms. Chu of California.
Children living in poverty endure lifelong adverse impacts on their childhood development and are at risk for poorer outcomes in health, developmental delays, and lower academic achievement. In my home state of California, despite having the 6th largest economy in the world, 1 in 5 children are living in poverty. That's nearly 2 million children. That means children struggling to learn because they have hungry bellies or who aren't getting the rest they need because they do not have a safe place to sleep every night. Unfortunately, income thresholds used to measure poverty in the United States remain much too low. So many households with children with incomes that greatly exceed the poverty line still experience significant financial insecurity and hardship. And that's why the supplemental poverty measure takes into account expenses like taxes, childcare, and out-of-pocket medical costs, and also accounts for benefits that reduce poverty like Social Security and the Earned Income Tax Credit. Of course, let us be clear. These measures remain at the level of recommendations by the National Academy of Science and are not what the title of this hearing says, that the Biden administration plans to redraw poverty lines, which is actually untrue. So, Ms. Maag, can you tell us why the SPM is important for policymakers, how it's used? Can you describe how its data better reflects the lived experiences of families with children? And does its conclusion align with other surveys' findings of increased material hardship over the past year?
The official poverty measure essentially asks you how much resources do you have before the government gets involved. The supplemental poverty measure gives you credit for everything you did on the governmental side. So when we see the supplemental poverty measure gives you credit for the expanded child tax credit. So we see poverty decline. We don't see that in the official poverty measure, even though we know all this money went into households, because it's not sensitive to tax payments. Supplemental poverty accounts for the different costs of living and allows us to better understand whether people are able to meet their needs.
And how is it used?
It's used merely as a gauge of how well our government programs are doing. That's why the National Academy panel recommended we talk about it instead of just the official poverty measure.
So it's a supplemental way of talking about the experiences of children.
That's correct.
Ms. Maag, it's clear that the best way to fight poverty is not to undermine independent data and research, but to learn from its findings and to do what Democrats on this committee throughout Congress and in the White House have been fighting for, which is restoring the expanded CTC. I also want to repeat that every one of us, Republicans and Democrats, have constituents who rely on this support. And they include people like Daisy, my constituent, who is a teacher in Pasadena and used the monthly CTC to support her young son, finally give him a comfortable way to live and rebuild her savings. So, Ms. Maag, can you talk about why direct cash support is so effective at reducing poverty? What did families typically buy with their CTC checks? And how do these benefits show up in the long-term outcomes for children who are lifted out of poverty because of benefits like the CTC?
Parents know what's best for their children, and so they're able to direct the resources in ways that are most efficient and productive. I come from Kansas. It's hard to get to work because of transportation systems. It's easy to find childcare. Here in DC, childcare is very expensive. And so when you give people a cash benefit, they're able to use the resource most wisely. The result is we saw improved health care, we saw reduced debt, we saw people making investments in their children in tutoring, saving for college, buying nutritious meals. It was sort of a whole lifetime of benefits depending on what your child needed.
And let me say, I'm a big proponent of expanding another powerful tool, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and expanding the age at which you qualify for it. Can you talk about how this credit would work with CTC to help both families and workers not raising children?
Yeah, the CTC, of course, is concentrated in households with children. The Earned Income Tax Credit has a very small component for workers without qualifying children. By expanding that, you essentially pick up a lot of low-wage workers. It's particularly powerful in rural communities as well as in Black and Hispanic households.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Moore of Utah.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Corinth, by your estimate, if the administration were to replace the official poverty measure with the supplemental poverty measure, it would increase the government spending on Medicaid and SNAP alone by $124 billion over the next decade. This number would be even higher when you factor in the dozens of other federal and state programs that are based on the official poverty measure. Do you have a sense for how much more it would be spent if every program that relied on this metric were updated to reflect the recommendations by the National Academy of Sciences?
Thank you, Mr. Moore, for the question. So there are over 31 different means-tested programs that are tied to the official poverty line and would thus be affected. Of those, there are 5 entitlement programs where spending would necessarily rise once you increase the poverty line. Of those 5 programs, Medicaid and SNAP are the 2 largest, and that's why I focused on those 2. But other important ones include the ACA, Affordable Care Act premium tax credits, Medicare Part D low-income subsidies, and the National School Lunch Program. Altogether, these 5 programs amounted to $954 billion of spending in 2021. So this would be a big change for these programs to increase eligibility.
And I think, to put it in plain English, what we've kind of heard from both arguments here is that, yeah, it costs more to live in California, and there's more higher costs in places like Washington, D.C., so we should provide more money. If we do that, will that incentivize policymakers in those areas to put in the right policy that will reduce costs over time, the actual problem, or would do the opposite?
It would have the opposite effect. These regulations that drive up things like housing costs or the costs of childcare are really the primary cause for why you have more spending on things like housing and childcare. If you incentivize states to increase costs in order to get more allocations for federal grants, that would be a step in the wrong direction. We should follow the increasingly bipartisan consensus that we need to take on the supply side, reduce regulations so we can build more housing and make more people able to afford basic needs.
Thank you. Professor Besharov, in your testimony, you discussed some of the background, how the official poverty measure was created. While it's not perfect, can you describe how that measure is a useful tool to see how well families are doing in the economy?
Yes, thank you for the question. So if you trace the official poverty measure across recessions and demographic changes, you can see them all in the official poverty measure. You can see the vast increase in retirement wealth that happened to the elderly. You can see the decline in poverty when the economy is doing well. In fact, if you track unemployment with the official poverty measure, you pretty much know what's going to happen to poverty. When you add the SPM, what you're really measuring is government spending. And that's a very valuable thing to have. It's just not the way you keep track of how the economy is treating low-income people. It is the way for measuring how the government is treating low-income people. And those are 2 different things.
Would you, continuing on, Professor, is it true that the presidential administrations regularly use the National Academy of Sciences as the basis for updates on how the federal government measures poverty?
Yes, but I can't imagine a Republican or a conservative president ever doing that again. And if I could spend 15 seconds
Please.
here, we have a president now who might not, but might do this thing. We might have another president who could easily change the table here with 2 changes. Count Medicaid benefits, which the SPM does not do, and count Medicare benefits. You count 2 of those, and you will really shift the table on who gets anti-poverty money. And so the message here, sir, is this is not just about Republicans versus Democrats. This is about Congress asserting the power of the purse to protect its prerogatives.
Thank you. I just want to underscore the point that we're approaching a $2 trillion deficit. We've seen that enormous amount of monetary supply, government spending directly impacts our inflation, and it creates a high inflationary measure. I don't think that can't be rebutted, in my opinion. And if we continue to argue that, look, costs are high, things are expensive, we got to give more money in these programs, like that's just simply not going to solve the problem. It's not going to incentivize the right type of policy. I agree with the same concept with tuition. Like, look, let's just kind of forgive some tuition, and then the universities are going to drive their prices down. Like, that is a nonsensical place to be, and we have to be willing to look at how to help people, encourage them to get out of poverty, and that's what this whole entire committee should be focused on. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I recognize Ms. Steele of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman LaHood, for holding this hearing, and thank you all the witnesses coming today. I'm thankful to hear from these leading experts on this, as this committee acts on these issues, and this is very important for our future and our future of generations too. Dr. Corinth, the National Academy of Science report is certainly alarming in their suggestion to elevate the supplemental poverty measure as the nation's headline poverty statistic. We have three leading experts on poverty measurement testifying before our committee today, yet I see none of your names on the list of authors of this report. Did the panel of authors for this report include any conservative perspectives?
Thank you, Ms. Steele, for the question. There were 13 members on the National Academy of Sciences panel which made this recommendation about the SPM. Of those 13, 12 had either donated or worked for a Democratic administration. 0 had donated or worked for a Republican administration. And as you suggested, it's not for lack of supply of willing or capable experts with differing perspectives. As you mentioned, there's people at this table who are not asked to serve. There's others as well who have the expertise, who could have served but were not asked and should have been.
So this report must be really skewed at this point.
It's certainly skewed based on the panel members, and I don't think that it reflects the academic consensus about poverty measurement.
Thank you. Professor Besharov, if I pronounced it wrong, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
You have done a tremendous amount of research on measuring poverty. These measurements are full of deep statistical analysis, but at the end of the day, deciding who is and who isn't in poverty is a moral judgment. Do you think it is right to unelected bureaucrats to have such power, or the ability for one administration to make such dramatic changes to the poverty rate? Do you believe this should be the role of Congress to set the poverty line?
Well, thank you for the question. As I was trying to suggest in my previous answer, we are at an important historical point where many of the norms of the past are changing. The norms about what a president will do or not do without the consent of Congress. And I would put this at that very high level of concern. It is about poverty measurement. It is about food stamp benefits. It is about military action. I can think of all sorts of things that the Congress has, in a sense, delegated great discretion to a president. And the Congress has done that because in the past, the presidents have had guardrails. And I see that changing. I see that changing about social policy. I see it changing about international policy. And in terms of the poverty line, I'm really worried that it gets politicized in both directions. It's one thing to say, well, let's just see if low-income families can get a little bit more money here. The other side of this is if we have a President Trump, I mean, one of the things he could very easily say is, well, let's see how we can benefit the people who voted for me. And I don't think that belongs in a poverty measure, either direction. And I think the only protection for that is a Congress, because even the minority in the Congress can prevent that. So it's important that we constrain the power of the executive, whoever that is.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Meyer, you have done a lot of research on this supplemental poverty measure. This can get very technical, but you can explain in simple terms some of the problems with the SPM and how that measure can inflate and misrepresent current poverty numbers.
Thank you for the question, Representative Steele. I don't have a lot of time, so let me just say that one of the worst problems with the SPM is that you'd like the poverty measure to identify the most deprived individuals, because that's ultimately the goal of poverty measurement. And the supplemental poverty measure in practice does not do a good job of that. It does a worse job than the official poverty measure and consumption poverty measures. One of the reasons for it is the issue that we've been focused on, that it would raise poverty thresholds where people can afford to spend a lot on housing. And those areas tend to be the areas where people are better off by a lot of indicators, and it would cut the poverty thresholds in areas where people are especially suffering.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Recognize Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and I thank all of our witnesses for their extraordinary testimony here today. I've been listening very carefully, and I want to make sure I understand what we're talking about here. The official poverty level, how many of you think that the official poverty level, were someone have to live off that, is enough for any size family to live on, whether it's in Mississippi or in New York? If that were their only source of income, how many of you think it's enough? You, Ms. Maag? You, Dr. Corinth?
Should I respond?
Yeah, just very
So I
quickly.
think the reason for that is, so Congress has tied SNAP eligibility for, say, 130% of the poverty line, or ACA.
But I mean, if someone just had poverty level wages and that was all the income they had, it's a baseline.
Yeah.
And anything, but you don't really think people can live off that, right?
I think that's a value judgment for you all to make.
That's a
not
value
for an
judgment
expert.
for us to make. So I'm very interested in this notion of consumption. Given the examples that all of you have talked about with someone talked about the coastal elites on California. I don't live there, or New York. Do people have any choice about how the high cost of housing is? I mean, you can be living in some rundown, rat-infested tenement, or you can be homeless in Oakland, California, and the cheapest property you could get could be $1,500 a month. And so the poverty measure there, I understand, is different than it would be in rural Arkansas. Does this consumption data measurement address that, Dr. Meyer? Would we be able to be more equitable if we use that measurement?
I think absolutely we would be able to be more equitable. It's not that there aren't people who are very deprived everywhere in the country. This is a question of figuring out where people are the worst off, because we want to direct resources especially to people who are the most worst off.
Right. We wouldn't want to skew the data by having a measurement of, say, rural Mississippi and say this is the level at which we expect people in New York or Brooklyn or Chicago, that this is the standard. And so you're going to have too many poor people if you raise, just say the OPM, not even the SPM, but if you just change that, you'll end up spending $124 billion because you're going to now disclose that we have more poor people. Isn't that really what the argument might be, Miss Maag, that this is a disclosure issue here?
That's right. Consumption, we don't have adequate data to really understand what people consume. Moreover, people consume using credit cards and the high-risk payday lending, selling plasma. These aren't the marks of an advanced society, and they certainly don't take a whole person's whole well-being into account.
With regard to this, okay, go on, Dr. Besharov here.
So what's tricky about this is, under the SPM, Black poverty doesn't change. Hispanic poverty goes up. Child poverty goes down. Elder poverty goes up. So all the questions you're asking are very valid. The answer to them is the way the Congress then sets the eligibility. It's 135% of the poverty line for food stamps, SNAP, 185 for WIC. These are judgments that are made program by program. And I think, speaking for myself only, the concern I have is that congressional set of decisions will not necessarily be the ones we'll have in the future if they change the poverty measure. I'm not disagreeing with whatever the number is, but the Congress keeps setting different ones anyway.
But the thing of it is, don't people need more help with housing and food? I mean, if you live in New York, I just can't imagine living there.
And the most direct way to do it, ma'am, is to say the housing benefit is not 150, it's actually, I think, by local costs, but the answer is not to make it 150% of poverty, it's to make it 175% of poverty.
Sneak one more question in.
Sure.
I don't know where you guys are getting this data, other than Mr. Hansen, you said you think it's a setback for us to take away work requirements. Ms. Maag, is there any data? I haven't read any literature that demonstrates that the child tax credit keeps people from working. It's an incentive to work. All of a sudden, you have extra $300 if you've got little bitty kids, and you can still work without being punished or without having to hide it or wondering if your social worker's going to catch you or bust you. Is there any evidence that there's a decreased work from refundable tax credits?
Evidence from multiple studies showed that families that received the child tax credit continued to work at the same rates as families who didn't receive the credit. There's also evidence that people use the child tax credit to pay for work supports such as transportation and childcare.
Like places like Lorain, Ohio, which has no public transportation. I don't know how these people get to work. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Recognize Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to our panel. These issues, I'm glad we can engage on this and certainly hear diverse perspectives and perspectives that I hope can lead to better outcomes. I worry when arbitrary designations are leveled across the country, viewing one state at a time monolithically. I don't like it when that happens even to Nebraska, and we're, 3 House seats. That's not a lot. Not to mention other states too that have, far more, I should say, just more diverse needs across their state, across the demographics. And so I just am very concerned that the federal government, especially without a vote of Congress, because I happen to think that you take this subcommittee right here, just us, I think we could come up with both sides more appropriate designations than what this proposal seems to outline. And it obviously gets folks in a defensive posture, especially when there's evidence that it's not a complete report, doesn't show a complete picture of reality. And so I would hope that we could exercise the legislative prerogative that we should have on this and work together for a solution. But Dr. Corinth, I'd like to discuss further some of the work you've done projecting what the proposed changes would be for various states. In addition to the chart that Chairman LaHood discussed earlier showing how replacing the official poverty measure with the supplemental poverty measure, SPM, would direct funding away from poor states and channel those dollars to rich states. You also created this map here behind me now. This one shows how the poverty line would change for a family of four if SPM were elevated. How is it that a family in California making $47,000 across the state, or a family in Colorado making $40,000 across the state, doesn't matter where they might live within the state, would be considered in poverty, while the same family just across the border from Colorado, say in my home state here, and this corner of Colorado and this end of Nebraska, pretty similar in terms of cost of living. And but how would you explain this and perhaps what you would propose instead?
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Smith, for the question. I don't think it makes sense to say that someone who has $47,000 of income in California is somehow worse off than someone who has $47,000 in one of those other lower income states. So I think that this solution is to have a constant poverty line across states. And that claim is based on research by Dr. Meyer, which actually finds that people who are near the poverty line in these different states, those who are in the lower income states, places like Mississippi and West Virginia, are actually worse off in terms of their food insecurity, the quality of their housing, and their health and even mortality outcomes than those near the poverty line in places like California.
Thank you. Let me just reflect back. I know that when we talk about rural issues, rural is a different dynamic, one state to another. Even within my own district, rural looks different than, say, remote or what some folks would call a frontier. And yet, we've been able, I know I don't want to speak for my colleagues necessarily, but I know we've worked together on channeling resources to people in need. And I think one of the best things that I want to point out right now is that those of us on both sides of the aisle here that care about making sure that people in need receive the benefits that can be most helpful and most appropriate to leading to better outcomes, that will happen far more appropriately with the legislative prerogative rather than throwing something out there from the administration that I think will harm people in need. And that's what concerns me greatly. And I would hope that we can continue to focus on this. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I know we've been working on this. I had the honor of chairing this subcommittee a while back and focusing on what we can do most effectively to positively impact people in need. That's what needs to be our focus rather than arbitrary designations. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Smith, thanks for your comments on that. I now recognize Mr. Evans of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, the ranking member, for your having this session. Thank you very much. I hope I get your name right, Miss
Maag.
Maag. I'd like to start out with you. Can you describe the impact of the CTC had on reducing financial hardship for families, and how did this allow families to invest in other aspects of their children?
We did work at the Urban Institute that shows it allowed people to pay off debts, even families with fairly high incomes. It also reduced food insufficiency. We did some work that was joint with other organizations that showed it allowed families to invest in their children and save for college.
What does the latest research say about how families, particularly Black and brown families, are struggling following the expiration of the expanded refundable tax credit?
As soon as the child tax credit payments ended, we saw dramatic increases in food insecurity among Black and brown households. We know from research by Bradley Hardy that the programs that exist today, the Earned Income Tax Credit, it's just not as good at addressing Black and white income gaps as a program like the Child Tax Credit when it's fully refundable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Recognize Ms. Tenney of New York.
I just want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and also thank you to all of you on the panel and for your hard work in this really important area. And I think that we're handling in Congress. And I appreciate some of the comments addressing the many people. I'm from New York State, and I live in one of the more rural areas, way upstate. So everyone thinks that we're all New York City. Well, we're not. We have issues with transportation upstate. We have issues with childcare, all those things. And my concern, and I just want to allude a little bit about what Mr. Smith said, is if the National Academy of Science project, I'm going to actually ask Dr. Meyer this question because you alluded to it earlier. What could you describe it? I know this is not an easy question. Some of the failings and how the National Academy of Science has reported on this poverty measurement that we're talking about with this chart on dealing with the supplemental poverty measure versus dealing with the official poverty line, and how it'll impact states like New York, where we have this huge difference between New York City and upstate New York.
So the supplemental poverty measure and the National Academy of Sciences report, as Dr. Corinth has emphasized and other panel members have emphasized, would really shift where we say the worst off are. Because it relies on what people are able to spend on housing in different areas, even though one of the ways that people can end up spending more on housing is they're just better off. They have more resources. That it uses that to figure out where we should direct resources. And kind of perversely, well, more than kind of.
Perversely?
It directs more resources to where people have lower mortality, better health, are able to spend more on food, have higher housing quality, have higher education, have more assets, have more long-term income if you look at their income over many years, have more appliances. Basically, in our research, we looked at everything that we could get our hands on.
Well, let me ask a quick thing, just because we have among the highest Medicaid rates per capita in the entire nation, by far.
Yes.
No one's even close, not even California. I think Alaska maybe because of the difficulty in navigating the terrain there. I mean, what's the impact? That must have a huge impact when you're talking about the SPM, or the Supplemental Poverty Measure.
Well, it turns out that Medicaid doesn't even enter the Supplemental Poverty Measure. It probably should.
Because the rate is so high, though, in terms of determining the poverty rate. So how would wouldn't that exacerbate the issue that we have?
Sure, it would make it harder if it were then used to determine eligibility. It would make it harder for people in rural New York to get on the Medicaid program because it would lower
the threshold.
The thresholds.
Right. Let me ask a quick question, Mr. Hansen. I love the work that you're doing on trying to get people back to work. And I just wanted to ask you about if we increase the amount of tax credits without a work requirement, what kind of impact is that going to have on employers? Because I'll tell you, the number one issue that I face every single day in my district is that we can't find people to go to work, and employers are willing to give bonuses, free childcare, pay 100% of health care. Can you tell me what you think that would do, and if you think it's a bad idea to remove the work requirement?
So Representative, what we offer most is the training to get into those kinds of jobs, because I bet the employers that you're talking about, generally speaking, are talking about a higher demand in terms of jobs. And for the people we work with, that's a choice they have to make. So in a rural community, you went to the same high school where your parents went to and where your grandparents went to. And, there's no choices along the way. But when we want them to take an extra step and to get more training, that's a choice. And so incentives make a difference on the margin. There's many for whom it doesn't, but there's very many for whom it does.
But would you say that it's better to have incentives to go to work as opposed to incentives to stay home?
Better to have incentives to go to work, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it. My time's out. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize Ms. Sewell of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I agree with Adrian Smith about our focus being on designation. Would really ask Ms. Maag, would you talk to us about whether or not there is a Biden plan to actually substitute the official poverty rate for the supplemental poverty rate?
I have not heard or seen any evidence that there is a move to replace the poverty rate. In fact, the report says the SPM should be elevated as a way to show the progress that's happening with government programs, not as a way of determining eligibility. It's a little bit circular even, because the SPM would count the benefit of the earned income tax credit or child tax credit or SNAP benefits. So you couldn't, base eligibility on that since it's endemic inside the measure.
Right. Conspiracy theories and squabbling about the designation doesn't change the fact that the reality about poverty. I represent Alabama's Black Belt, a very proud product of Alabama's rural Black Belt. But our rate of poverty is much higher than the rate in Alabama writ large. And the reality is that lots of the kids that I represent go to bed hungry. We as a committee do make choices. And I have to tell you, I'm proud of the fact that during the pandemic, that the House Democrats decided to make fully refundable the child tax credit. It cut poverty in half. This is not a statistic. I just want to talk just about how it did it in my district. The fact of the matter is that so many more of my constituents had money in their pockets monthly. Because we paid it monthly, and because we made it fully refundable, there are lots of families in my district, the working poor, who don't make enough to pay taxes. And so by getting that fully refundable, you actually brought in a whole nother swath of people who otherwise would not have been able to get the child tax credit. Can you talk to us about whether or not the child tax credit somehow decreased rural America? Because I don't think that that's true. I actually don't think that somehow the child tax credit made it worse for rural America versus urban. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The evidence suggests that a larger share of rural children are left out of the child tax credit today than urban children. And so when we made the credit fully refundable, it meant children in urban areas had equal access to the credit. Moreover, there's evidence that people, when they have low incomes, they delay getting health care and they are hungry. And what we saw
let's talk about this work requirement. I haven't seen evidence in my district that people are incentivized when they get Medicare, Medicaid, when they get SNAP benefits or TANF benefits. In fact, the majority of the people who receive SNAP in my district have children under the age of 16. So when I think about the face of welfare or the face of SNAP or the face of CTC, it's a child's face that I see, not some, welfare queen. So talk to me about whether or not CTC and other anti-poverty measures actually discourage work. Do you believe that? And the statistics show that?
The research at the Urban Institute suggests that no, it does not discourage work. There has been some evidence that sometimes people would, a secondary earner might stay home with their child. You might see families with very young children more likely to stay home.
But that has a lot to do with the fact that childcare costs are so high.
Exactly. And a lot of people would say it, in some circumstances it's good. The Bipartisan Policy Center recently released a report. They said that estimates that suggested that there was a large disincentive to work were overstated. They were anomalies in the data, and they weren't what the majority of studies were showing.
I think that, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I just want to say that instead of focusing on designations that may or may not come, I really would hope that this committee would try to find some solutions to deal with the reality of poverty that is in America. The greatest country in the world should not have as many children who are poor and in poverty, and people who are in poverty. And I'd like to work on better incentives to create skilled labor and provide people an opportunity here. People don't want a hand. I can only speak for my district, but people in my district, the vast majority, they don't want a handout, they want a hand up. And this committee can provide that. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. Your comments are well taken, and look forward to working with you on that. Recognize Mr. Meyer from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and thank all of you for being here. I'm, again, with you, Mr. Chairman, and my friend, Ms. Sewell. I'm very impressed that everyone here cares about this deeply, and that it affects every one of our districts. Even, I have one of the wealthiest districts in the country, Northern Virginia, and yet there are huge pockets of poverty. You know, the schools in Mason District, 90% of those kids are Title I. And I am a little confused about the hearing, but it turns out the Biden administration is not actually planning to apply the supplemental poverty measure. That should be a relief to everyone here. And on this notion of the incentive to go to work, the incentive to stay home, I was privileged to have my mom stay home and raise the 6 kids. I do think the child tax credit, by definition, goes to parents, mostly mothers, and those people who would drop out of the workforce to stay home and take care of their kids. I think we have to recognize that there is a balance there between the enormous advantages to having a mother stay home raising her children versus a mom that's rolling in at 6:30 at night exhausted, and the kids are latchkey kids, et cetera, et cetera. And we, as we push for work requirements, I think we miss out on the challenge of having one-parent families, no-parent families, families where the parents aren't around at all. Ms. Maag, you mentioned the cost of child poverty between $500 billion and $1 trillion, largely due to lost productivity. And there are several key programs which we talked about. One I want to focus on particularly is SNAP, because we're redoing the 5-year agriculture bill. There have been a number of Republican amendments already to make SNAP benefits ever harder to access. 5 or 6 times a year, I'll work the food banks in Northern Virginia, and the lines are sometimes, you can't see the end of the line, especially down near Fort Belvoir, where these are mostly soldiers and their families standing in line. How important is it for us to look at things like SNAP as part of the overall addressing poverty in a meaningful way?
Research we did at the Urban Institute suggests that these programs are interconnected, and so we ought to be supporting the whole child. Analysis showed that if we gave better access to SNAP, maybe increasing teen benefits, increasing per child benefit in the summer, and increasing overall allotment can substantially reduce poverty.
Yeah. And let me also I'm not sure who to ask this question to, but Ms. Maag, let me just stick with you. It seems to me from a poverty perspective, the real challenge we have is that people make too little money, that you have an awful lot of people working full-time. I spent a lot of time in Southwest Virginia, where there are a lot of jobs, and they're jobs that are all going begging, but they all pay $7.25 an hour. And we're pushing them up to some to $8 and $9. And how do you ever raise a family on that or not be dependent on government transfer payments? I had the extraordinary privilege of being U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland for 4 years, where there was virtually no poverty. You know, the embassy Marines always have the Toys for Tots program. They stopped it because they couldn't find any kids to give it to. But when I left in 2013, the minimum wage was $48,000 a year. So my Republican friends reasonably hate the transfer payments, taking from the the wealthy and giving to the poor. And it's a great source of structural discord in our country. What if you didn't have to have transfer payments because we pay people a living wage? And we stay away from all that too much. But
If jobs pay enough and they allow people to cover their childcare costs and their basic needs, then people are more able to go to those jobs to work. So it's absolutely a way to lift people out of poverty. And interestingly, it would lift you out of both SPM poverty and OPM poverty if you had higher earnings in your household.
yeah, and I think it's also really important to note, there's a study last week that the average Fortune 500 CEO makes 399 times the average income of his other employees, not the least paid, but the average of the rest of his employees. The money is there, the resources are there. We're an extraordinarily wealthy nation, but they tend to be concentrated in a few places and not shared with the vast majority of the people that we really care about. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer, for your comments. That concludes our questions and answers. And I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for the very substantive and comprehensive questions and dialogue and conversation today. And obviously, I want to thank our 5 witnesses here today for your valuable testimony and for adding to the conversation that we're having here today. As we have seen, changing the nation's official poverty measure would have profound implications on how federal assistance is distributed to millions of Americans across the country. And I hope with the dialogue we had here today, we can work together in a bipartisan way to ensure Congress is the final arbitrator of the setting eligibility for vital programs we create for Americans most in need. Please be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record. With that, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all.